We've just gone step by step through this entire process of what a neuron does, starting with its creation of proteins, which we then call neurotransmitters, and its movement of ions down the axon through a process known as the action potential, and finally the release of the neurotransmitters into the synapse, known as exocytosis. And all for what purpose? So the reason that this entire thing has happened, the release of these neurotransmitters, is simply so that they can cross the synapse and actually bind to tiny receptors on the next cell. And these receptors are kind of like keyholes. And you can think of the neurotransmitters as keys. And when they bind to these receptors, like keys to a lock, what this allows to happen is for ion gates inserted into the axon to allow small amounts of sodium to enter. So if you remember back to how our action potential works, by sneaking into the cell, sodium is going to change the polarity of the axon and allow an action potential to occur. By binding to the receptors on the neuron, neurotransmitters are causing a change in the permeability of these ion gates. So by being the key that activates the lock, it allows these gates to open up a little bit. Sodium sneaks into the cell, and the entire process of the action potential starts over. Once the action potential fires, it hits the end of the cell, or the cell terminal of the axon, allows the release of their neurotransmitter into the synapse, and the whole process is repeated from neuron to neuron to neuron. Now, this might not sound very exciting, but in fact, it is extraordinarily exciting because it is this process of these cells communicating with each other that allows a pattern of neuronal firing or function that leads to things like how we think and how we feel. One good way to think about this in terms of the fact that if it all works right, things turn out and you have somebody who can think and feel properly is to think about what happens when these neurotransmitters are not being properly created. Let's say that the instructions in our DNA are a little bit off, or there's a step missing. So the protein that eventually is going to be produced by that neuron might not be quite the right shape, or the neuron might not actually produce quite enough of that protein. So that means the neuron's not producing enough neurotransmitter. So we can think of a neurotransmitter known as serotonin. Serotonin is responsible, or is the main neurotransmitter produced in all the neurons involved in how we regulate our mood and sort of keep our mood mediated and positive and in control. When we don't produce enough serotonin due to some flaw in the DNA or in the blueprint, what happens is that those neurons can't fire anymore enough. They don't fire properly. Not enough neurotransmitters getting released from one neuron to the next to let an action potential happen. So if those neurons aren't firing, that entire system that's involved in mood regulation isn't working right. And that's when you see mood disorders such as clinical depression. Disrupting the normal production of these neurotransmitters is actually how external chemicals such as drugs or narcotics or even legal drugs work. A major neurotransmitter for our muscles and heart to work properly is acetylcholine. So the way a lot of nerve gases work that are used in chemical warfare is that they actually block the ability of acetylcholine to bind to the next neuron. If acetylcholine can't cross the synapse and actually bind to the receptors in the next neuron, what happens is that those neurons can't fire. So if the neurons in your muscles aren't firing, if the neurons telling your muscles to move aren't firing, if the neurons telling your heart to beat aren't firing, what happens is that they stop working. Your heart can't pump, and your muscles don't work, and you end up with paralysis and eventual death. Other drugs can actually act to mimic the actions of naturally produced neurotransmitters. And drugs such as cocaine actually look and are shaped a lot like a neurotransmitter known as dopamine. Now, dopamine is involved in rewarding behaviors that our systems think are adaptive or good for us. So when you do cocaine, this mimics dopamine, and it binds in a massive amounts to all the neurons that can receive dopamine. So you get this huge influx of feelings of reward, of pleasure, of empowerment, and excitement.
Vizi online texts are a new kind of textbook built with the help of great subject matter experts. These new learning resources have already helped thousands of students succeed. Our original content uses animations, simulations, video and graphics, self-assessments, exercises, and review materials to engage students in their study. Our approach is proven to improve learning outcomes, and that's why Vizi exists, to transform lives by making education more engaging.